left the Israeli Navy, I was probably 25, 26 years old at the time. I went traveling, so I backpacked through East Africa for about 6, 7 months. So I think that was something that kind of always stayed with me, seeing how people live very different lives in the tropics or in the developing world. And so I always, so this is one, and I will connect it. The second part is that after I returned and after I went to engineering school, I started working for about 6 years as a professional private equity and venture capital investor in food and agriculture. So initially working in Israel and Europe, but then for about 3 years in California as an investor. And I had really the privilege of working with some of the best companies in the space, and people using advanced genetics and machine learning and computer vision, all of this really exciting stuff in agriculture. But what was interesting for me is the combination of both. So I saw how these amazing technologies get used to, in some way, to make the life of the, let's call it the American farmer, better, more productive, more efficient, and provide more healthier, cleaner food for the Western consumer. And that was such a massive uh, step away from what I saw in East Africa, for example, because eventually, you see the American farmer, and I used to spend a lot of time in places like, Iowa and in the Midwest, etc. And you see, I used to remember as a joke saying that every farmer that you see, and you see these massive farms with the pigs and the corn, etc. I would say each one of those are multi-millionaires. Just the value of their land is, $10 million or more. So it gave them a lot of opportunity. They used to send their children to very good schools, get best medicine possible, etc. And then you see the farmer in the developing world, and they don't use any. They're not even aware of any of these technologies. They use the same seeds of that their ancestors used, and they don't get any access to this, and they live a very poor life. So they don't necessarily have money to get better food, better education, better healthcare, etc. So I saw this disparity and also an opportunity to bring some of these really exciting technologies to improve the lives of the people who need it the most. That became, even to some degree, our mission. And the scale is interesting because we talk about in the West, in Europe, in North America, we think about corn, soy, cotton, even tomatoes, a lot of the foods that we consume, but we don't always realize how big everything else is. So if we think about the populations of the tropics, so this is about 40% of humanity today, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America. It's also the fastest growing. So it's supposed to be about 50% of humanity in 2, 3 decades. And they consume different crops than we eat necessarily. So Tropic today, we work, for example, on bananas, coffee, and rice. Bananas, we don't necessarily, so we eat a lot of bananas. This is, I eat a couple of bananas every day, but it's the fourth most important food crop on the planet. Massive source of income for hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people. And while there are thousands of people working to make corn a little bit better every year, there's very, very few people working to improve the banana, or actually save it from some of the diseases that are threatening this crop today.
Are you a little surprised? It makes sense if you think about just the kind of adoption cycles that this new technology rolls out and Western or American farmers are the first to adopt it and use it and, get the benefits out of that. That makes sense. But when you talk about coffee and bananas and rice, like those are huge,
Yeah.
huge markets. On paper, it seems like, well, how did this kind of it seems like it's been overlooked. How did it get overlooked? And you're saying, hey, there's an opportunity here that's a little bit more untapped and there's a lot of need here. And that's why we're going to put our time and energy into it. I mean, is it fair to say it was overlooked, or maybe, and you guys are kind of getting to it in early stages, or how would you frame that?
Wow, it's a good question. I've had several theories on why that happens. If you ask me tomorrow, I might give you a different answer, but I think that to oversimplify it, I think that a big part of it is the physical distance between the research and the field.
Mm.
For example, again, corn and soy, people grow it in the Midwest, and you don't need to travel very far to get to some very, very, very good universities and research institutions in across the United States, or in Europe, you'll go to Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany. There are very good research institutions that are close and they sit under the same government. So the government will put money into researchers in the same country, in Europe or in North America, to improve the genetics, for example, for the local farmers. Now, if you look at banana, corn, banana, coffee, and rice, the government that where the crops are being grown is usually quite removed from the people who consume it, and usually they don't have a lot of money. So if you look at the country that exports the most bananas today in the world, Ecuador, there is research done there, but from an R&D spend, it's nothing compared to what you would see in North America and in Europe. So I think it's the allocation of R&D money.
Yeah, that's making a lot of sense.
Yeah.
In another way, I would think about it as maybe, in the US, as an example, you have both the supply and the demand side all in the same country, whereas you're talking about groups that are providing the supply, but they themselves don't have the demand as much. And so there's just a different kind of infrastructure and incentives in place that have put them behind.
So this is one part of it. It's a big part of it. As we were speaking, I'm thinking about it. So you will see, for example, some research done in, Western academic institutions on crops like coffee, banana, or kind of other tropical crops, but it's usually considered as charitable or altruistic type research. We want to help the people in the developing world. Now, in order to make effect in the field, the basic research is very important, but it's usually, it's one professor and a couple of postdocs or something like that. It's very small scale, but in order to then scale it and bring it to the field, you need something that's quite complex and large. So there are no small seed companies in the genetic space. Usually we're talking about big organizations that can, do IP and regulation and different types of research. And those bodies today, those big organizations, these big seed companies are also today based in the developed markets and much less so in the developing world.
Yeah. I want to get into each of the efforts with coffee, banana, and rice. But before we do, I'm curious how you explain what Tropic Bio does when you're talking to someone who's outside the industry, who doesn't know all the kind of, isn't as familiar with it. Like, how do you describe it to maybe a friend over drinks or something like that?
Again, it depends on the drink, but
Right.
I would say that Tropic is one of the leading agricultural gene editing companies in the world. And we're based in the UK. We're a team today of about 150 professionals. And we develop new varieties of tropical crops, primarily coffee, banana, and rice, using gene editing and other genetic tools. So taking existing elite varieties of these crops and improving them to make them more resistant to diseases or better quality, etc., with the intention of eventually selling them back to farmers. So we are building a global tropical seeds company. So maybe similar to what we see in the Western world, companies like BASF, Bayer, Corteva, which are seeds companies primarily associated with vegetables or corn and soy. We want to do the same thing, but with tropical agriculture.
Yeah. And my understanding is that coffee is a big focus of yours right now. Do you want to talk a little bit about why that is a primary focus and what the kind of the opportunity is there, or maybe what the problem that existed with coffee that you saw?
Sure. So coffee, interestingly, was the first crop that we started to work on when we founded the company in 2016. And coffee maybe to start, is very, very large industry. We take it almost for granted sometimes. And as I'm speaking, I'm raising
Yeah.
a glass of coffee in mine and drinking it. Humanity consumes north of 2 billion cups of coffee every day. It's the most popular or the most consumed beverage after water. It has a consumer market, or depending on the research, but I would say $250 billion a year is a fair estimate. But also on the production side, it's massive. So the data that we have is that about 25 million people on the planet work in coffee cultivation. And if you add to that, the family members, that's probably another 100 million people. So you have 125 million people on the planet that depend primarily for their livelihood on coffee production. That's more than 1% of humanity. So it's a very, very, very big group. Now, the challenge that we see with coffee, I would say, is probably not very different from all other crops that we're seeing, which is, farmers, of course, always want more yield, better quality. So there's always kind of this race to do better. But at the same time, what is different today from maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago is climate change. So across the board, what we're seeing, so there's always challenges now with changing weather patterns. Areas where it was always relatively easy to grow any crop today, it's harder because suddenly you have more water, less water, more heat, different challenges. So that's always a big issue now with climate change. There is a secondary aspect of it that people don't appreciate so much is diseases. So we're just seeing outbreaks of everything. Every crop that we see today, there's a few diseases that maybe a few years were manageable and small. Now everything is out of control because once the ecological systems kind of get out of balance, diseases move in. So there's a lot of things to do with coffee. And what we've seen probably over the last year and a half is also that coffee prices have jumped up quite significantly because of challenges with supply, all kinds of weather issues in Brazil, etc. Now, in most crops, the standard way of overcoming some of these challenges would be either through investment in the field in all kinds of technology, which is not very simple in coffee because most these people who are producing coffee are not very wealthy, or through traditional breeding. So basically taking the existing crop and breeding it to make it higher yielding, better tasting, more resistant to disease. The challenge with coffee is that it's a tree, and it takes a lot of time to breed. It can take you 25, 30 years to breed a new variety of coffee, even if it's possible. And that's too long to wait. Here comes gene editing that allows you to much more precisely change the genetic makeup of the coffee tree without necessarily having to wait 30 years to efficiency. It's much faster. For example, one of the things that we're doing today in coffee is what's called high solubility coffee. So it's something that we started several years ago. So, for example, today, about just over 40% of coffee production in the world is what's called Robusta coffee. So it's not the nice Arabica coffee that we buy in our, nice coffee shop in London. It's primarily used for instant coffee production, which is about 40% of global consumption. Through gene editing, we can change the bean of the tree to make it a bit more soluble. So it's easier to extract the instant coffee or the coffee solids from it. So eventually you can increase the yield of production from the field quite significantly. And if you want to use it in different ways, you can say that it's, what used to take 11 hectares of coffee to produce, now you can do it in 10 or 9 hectares of land. So there are benefits of it. So this is just one example. I think in the future we might look also at other things in coffee, for example, diseases, which again are a big issue in every crop today.
Yeah. So it sounds like you have the ability to say, we can do things that increase yield. Growing is a risky business, and we can mitigate risk by being more resistant to diseases or changes in the weather and whether that's temperature or water. Like these are things that are on the table that your guys team is working on. Who are the when you're speaking with people, who are the early adopters who get it and are very attracted to that instant? I'm sure you talk to some people who are more interested in this than others.
Yeah. So it very much depends on the industry. And we usually speak with a lot of people along the value chain, all the way from the farmers to the traders to the processors and even the retailers and consumers. But I will say that it's not in different crops it might be the different people, but probably the big differentiator from who very much listen to who care less has to do very much with need. So, for example, usually the farmers are very much in need because they are, the first to be
Yeah.
affected by everything, and they are they are traditionally retained the least in the value chain. But these things they go downstream. So I would say, for example, 2 years ago when coffee prices were relatively low, we could come to a big coffee company, talk to them, we can improve yield or this, and they were okay. It's very nice, very interesting. We all keep us informed. Now, when coffee prices are much higher and there's challenges with supply, suddenly everyone's attention is more directed. Rice, 3 years ago when we made the strategic decision to increase to incorporate a third crop, rice, a lot of people came and said, rice, it's not interesting, it's smallholders, no one cares, there's no money in rice, and we strongly believe that actually there is an opportunity in rice because eventually, rice is close to 25% of global calorie consumption, and why does no one care about rice?
Right.
Today, I think the question has been answered. It's not just that food prices have increased, there are shortages of rice in some very, very big places like India. And suddenly all of the big companies that, 3 years ago didn't understand why we're doing rice, suddenly everyone wants to do rice and suddenly everyone is interested. So I would say that key pillar for us has always been to really focus where the need is greatest. Sometimes it's not very visible today, but it might become visible in a few years. And I know it's quite bleak to say it, but because of climate change, anything that bets on improving yield, finding of diseases, it's a very good bet because things are not going to be better in a few years.
Of the three that you're working right now between coffee, banana, and rice, which one is the most sensitive to temperature changes or fluctuations in precipitation?
All of them.
Really?
All of them. They're modern agriculture has become so advanced. So think about most of these crops as Lamborghinis. These are highly developed. We think about. I'll give you an example. Banana. When we started to work on banana 6 years ago, in my mind, I thought about banana cultivation. Go to the jungle and there's people with machetes, hauling bunches of bananas. There are these people as well, but it's an incredibly sophisticated supply chain and process. There's a lot of different types of physical handling in it. It's an incredibly fine-tuned supply chain, and as these things evolve, every single cog in the machine, can create a lot of disruption. So all of them are very sensitive to different diseases. And we see it over the last few years, whether it's Corona and then everything that came after, everything is
Yeah.
sensitive.
Do you come into many misconceptions, whether it's among like what you might call like late adopters in the industry or different players in the industry who just don't fully understand what it is that your team is working on or what the what the solution, why this solution is so needed? Is there anything like misconceptions that you wish you could just clear up?
There's a few. But I would say philosophically, I would say that people don't understand a lot of people, especially in, we're based in the UK, okay? People in the UK, we spend on average about 8.3% of our income on food. So over the last couple of years, food prices globally have come up by 40%. So, I go to the market next to my house, and now I pay £4.50 for a piece of bread that used to cost me 3.5 pounds a year ago. And I'm okay, it's fine. I buy it. It's good bread. You have places like the Philippines where people would spend 40% of their income on food, and now add on top of that another 40%. Their lives have been tremendously impacted. So I think people don't necessarily realize how big the problem is and how much it's not going to be any easier over the next 20, 30 years. Climate change is not coming down. And this discussions of, should we adopt this technology or that technology, or I don't imagine that we have so much privilege anymore. We will need to use every tool in the box in order to continue people well fed. I see, again, philosophical, but, let's put that aside. Other misconceptions, I think we get asked a lot about regulation, for example, because people talk about gene editing. Is it GMO? Is it genetic modification? And because there's a lot of different terminology that's being used. So a lot of the time we try to clarify, to explain what it is that we're doing. What we would usually say is that there's a difference between regulation and science. GMO, genetic modifications, are regulatory definitions, whereas gene editing or other things is scientific. So on the science side, we usually differentiate between two types of science, what's called transgenesis and gene editing today. So transgenesis is still a big thing, but it's the process of transferring genes or DNA from one organism to another. So for example, if I want to have a corn that is resistant to a certain disease, I might take a gene that conveys resistance to this disease from another plant and move it to the corn through genetic means. This is transgenesis, and this is colloquially referred to today as a GMO, genetically modified organisms, and it's very hard to bring such products to the market. Many countries forbid it. Gene editing is a different, it's primarily a lot of tools that have been developed over the last decade, even though there are older variants. But the interesting benefit of gene editing that it allows us to do these types of change the DNA of plants, for example, without incorporating foreign DNA. So in many places in the world, or I would say growingly almost all of the world today, it is regarded as non-GMO. So it's gene edited, it's regulated, but not regulated as GMO. So it's much faster to bring these products today to the market. It's much cheaper, it's much more available. And it's what allows us to do it in banana, whereas 10 years ago, in the day of the GMO, it would have been too expensive and impossible for a company like us to work on bananas.
Yeah.
So that's another conception. Yeah.
Do you feel like those differences in the way regulation interprets that for the consumer to see that label is in a good place, or do you think that consumers' continued misunderstanding of this is harmful because there are brands or suppliers who are fearful of that misconception, and so they stay away from new advancements because they don't know how the public will respond to that, or maybe somewhere in between?
I think it's a very good question. At least my understanding, my philosophy is that it all eventually comes down to the consumer. So the brand, the regulation. Eventually, the regulators care about the public, as they should. and they're also driven by the public. So if the public, so for example, in the 1990s, the public had a lot of concerns about transgenesis or GMO technology. I would say probably most of these have been, it's proven to be a very safe source of food, but at the time, the public, or the way some of the companies brought these products to the market, they didn't discuss with the public enough, and the regulators reacting to the panic that came from the consumers created regulatory barriers that are very, very high. I would say that understanding that eventually the public both impacts regulation as well as the brands, because brands, they want to sell to the public, and if the public doesn't like what they're selling, so they'll avoid it. So for us, a lot of our focus was about communicating with the public from day one, and based on some very, very basic principles. So the first principle is that we only work on products that are not just very, very good, they're also relatively easy to explain. So I can sit with you and talk to you about why it is important to have a high solubility coffee or banana that is resistant to the disease that's killing off the bananas. There are other things that we could have worked on that might actually be good, but it's very hard to explain. People just don't get it. So we try to avoid that. So this was the first principle. The second principle has been to be very, very transparent. So while we saw in the past companies that were doing these different types of genetics, but trying to give it different names, so instead of calling it gene editing, calling it, advanced breeding technologies or kind of everything but saying the word gene or genetics, we've always said, we use the most cutting edge technologies to solve some of the biggest problems in the world. We invite people like yourself and others to come and visit us, take pictures, tell our story. We are an open book to create a level of trust with the public, so people understand. We are not. There's no secret sources. Everything is available to them.
Do you feel like people have taken you up on that transparency and that has paid off?
I think so. I think first of all, again, this is maybe just my observation. I think that Tropic has become kind of almost an example in the genetics world of how to do that. So I think that more and more groups are following our lead and using this philosophy on how to do it, and that's good. Secondly, and this is definitely not something that we can take credit for, is the world has changed a lot over the last few years. So climate change and food prices. So from the regulator side, there's been tremendous advancements over the last year. Countries like China, India, Nigeria, UK a week or earlier this week. Europe is now changing, and I think a big part of it is because people understand that you can't feed the world if you tie both hands behind your back. And secondly, climate change in the sense that while 4 years ago I would speak with people like yourself or others in open forums, and everyone would ask, is it GMO? Is it GMO? Is it GMO? The question today is very much around, is it good for climate change or is it bad for climate change? Can you reduce greenhouse gas emissions or not? So the topic of the conversation have changed, and in a way that is good for us because yes, we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we increase biodiversity, etc.
Yeah, the framing has completely changed, and priorities are shifting in a way that hopefully has put the GMO, non-GMO probably in a better context. It sounds like. Where would you say you are on in your mind's eye of where you see this going? Where would you classify? What stage of the journey are you on today? And have there been certain stages to this point you're like, wow, that was an important one that I'm glad we've got to at this point?
Wow, we've evolved a lot as a company over time, and I think that one of the things that I'm proud of, and I imagine that my colleagues are very proud, is that we have also been able to really mature and evolve as a company. I think that even though the founders are still with the business, including myself, I think we've changed a lot. Our we've become more experienced, our style has changed. But I would say that where we are today is actually very interesting because 3 years ago we completed our Series B funding round. Interestingly, I think it was like the first or second week of Corona in the UK, so it was a very have a lot of stories to tell the grandchildren
I
about
bet.
that. We were incredibly fortunate that round was led by Temasek, one of the best investment groups in the world, and they backed us 100%. There was never a discussion about global pandemic. Talk to us. They were fully with us. But the reason I'm saying is that at that time we set a set of 3-year strategic milestones for ourselves, which are about to conclude tomorrow. And interestingly, those 3-year strategic milestones were very much around, they represent the company that we were 3 years ago. So 40 people compared to 150 today, very, very scientific oriented. And a lot of our work over the last few years has been on scientific breakthroughs, how to gene edit in bananas and how to do disease resistance in rice, etc., etc. And I think now that we are launching our strategic goals for the coming 3 years, it's a major evolutionary step for us where we are transitioning significantly more towards product commercialization. So bringing our products to the field, to the farmers, to the market, and that requires a tremendous evolutionary step for the company. So today, I think we're very much in a kind of a big evolutionary jump for ourselves. And I think maybe one of the very pleasant surprises for me is that it's not painful at all. So we don't see resistance. I think the people within the organization, whether they are technicians, researchers, anyone, they want to see their products in the
Yeah.
market. So everyone really, really supportive, very, very enthusiastic towards it.
That's great. I've always said that innovation craves distribution, and it sounds like that's what you've done. You've innovated, and now you're to that point where distribution's about to take off, and everybody can see the fruits of their labor. Maybe pun intended on that. What do you think is next for either the industry or Tropic? Like, what do you, as you kind of look forward over the next year, 5 years, 10 years, like any predictions or things that you foresee?
It's a good question. I think we've been fairly good over the last 6-7 years in kind of predicting the future, and our life wasn't hard. We made some bold predictions, but they were very, very simple. Food prices are going to go up, yeah, because of climate change.
Yeah.
People
Yeah.
more and more. I'm not sure that it's going to change much. I think it's actually going to get much worse, unfortunately. We've had 7 good years for the industry, not just for Tropic, but I think the future is the same challenges that we are seeing today in global weather and agriculture are just going to get deeper and deeper and deeper. For the industry, I believe that even though we are seeing kind of on the macroeconomic level, there's recessions, and I think a lot of startups are struggling today, unfortunately. I still believe that in the fields of agriculture or more broadly, even impact and sustainability, I think there's still going to be a lot of interest and focus. So I'm very optimistic. And if I was to predict what's going to happen next 7 years, the weather is not going to get any better. It's going to get worse. And people, creating more food with less is not going to get any easier.
Yeah. It's the reality. And so I think that's why we should all appreciate that we've got people like yourselves tasking themselves with problems like this. I'm assuming that there's people who are listening in who are curious to learn a little bit more about what you guys are up to. Where would you point them to if they wanted to learn more about Tropic Bio?
So we I don't know, maybe because we are based in the UK and we're based in Norwich, and I think we're quite humble by nature. So we rarely, we don't kind of do press releases every other day, etc. We like being quiet and focusing on our work. But I would say probably the best place where we kind of aggregate everything that comes to us is on our LinkedIn page. So unfortunately, we don't have yet LinkedIn or Instagram, etc. So sorry, we don't have like Twitter or Instagram, but LinkedIn we are. So everything is there. There's always a job adverts. Any piece of news that's interesting gets published there. And also on our website. The website is kind of tells our story, and we're always looking for good people to join us. And there's opportunities not just for researchers, but also for people on the business side, strategy, IP, regulation. We'll continue to go in the next few years, and we'll love having very good people on board.
Yeah, I'll vouch for that. I think your website is very strong at telling your stories, so I would encourage anybody to go check it out. I think it does a nice job of kind of visualizing some of what we've talked about today. Appreciate the time. This has been great. I've really enjoyed hearing what you guys are up to. I think it's I love the mission, love what you guys are putting out in the world.
It's our pleasure. Thank you. We're incredibly proud. We have a phenomenal team. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.